Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Pro Wrestling Chat. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Erschen. And this week we are talking about WCW, yes, World Championship Wrestling. Definitely was a big fan of WCW. And during the infamous Monday Night Wars, I was actually on the side of WCW, you know. I was more into their show than I was WWE. So yeah, I started out, I was actually a fan long before the Monday Night Wars. So I used to watch both shows even back then, you know. Obviously WWE was great at that time. It was like the mid-80s when I started watching. And you had Hulk Hogan on top of his game. You had Macho Man Randy Savage, obviously. You had so many great characters. You had Jake the Snake Roberts. You had Roddy Piper. You had Andre the Giant, King Kong Bundy. You had all these awesome stars, and they were making great shows. You know? But I still watched N.W.A, as it was known back then, National Wrestling Alliance, because they had a great roster too, and they had the Road Warriors. I love them. And you had Ric Flair, of course, was the man. You know, he was champion most of the time. And you had people like Nikita Koloff, the badass Russian dude. You had the Four Horsemen going on. You had the Fabulous Freebirds, you know, Steiner Brothers. They had a lot of great stars, but some of the storylines were kind of bland because you had people running the show that didn't really know much about wrestling. Ted Turner owned WCW since the 70s, so, you know, he had the money. He just let people run it that were like his friends, but they didn't really know what they were doing. So when that didn't work, they hired wrestlers to see if they could run it. So they gave the helm to people like Ole Anderson and Bill Watts, and, you know, they were like these old school mentality wrestler guys that were stuck in the past, stuck in the days of when it was just wrestling and not enough on the entertainment side. So they didn't really have the vision. So once they invested in Eric Bischoff, that's when things started to change, you know. Because he was this young guy, he was just an announcer at that time, and a commentator, but he did have experience. He worked for N.W.A under Vern Gagne, so he knew a lot about wrestling, but at the same time, he was this young, intelligent guy who was very creative as well. So things started really changing once Ted Turner decided to invest in him. And Ted Turner did have a grudge against Vince McMahon. They had a falling out. At one time they worked together because WWE was on TBS for a while, but they clashed, you know, the egos clashed and they stopped working together. And I think the reason why WCW was able to eventually topple WWE is because of that grudge Ted Turner had with him. He's like, you know what, I'm going to kick your ass. I'm going to start putting real money into this, and I'm going to go after you. And he did, with a vengeance. So with someone creative, they finally turned the corner and were able to compete with WWE. They had the balls, they had the sack to start Monday Night Nitro on Monday to go directly against the WWE. And they had just recently signed Hulk Hogan, the biggest star ever in WWE, you know. So that was a huge factor. And then all of a sudden you had the Macho Man, who was being put out to pasture as well in WWE. He was just an announcer, but in his mind he wasn't done. He still wanted to wrestle, so that's why he went to WWE. WCW. So there you have two of the biggest stars from WWF days in WCW, and they were getting a lot of fans in the seats, you know. But they couldn't just rely on those guys. They needed young talent too. I mean, you needed to have that mix, you know, the veterans like Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, and you had Sting still as one of the top baby faces. But you needed the young guys too. You need some young talent. So they brought in Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, who were big stars in WWE, and they were young guys. You know, these young bucks, these big, huge, jacked up guys, and they had great characters. You know, Scott Hall was Razor Ramon, and Diesel was Kevin Nash, and when they came over, it was like, wow, you got the young bloods, you got the legendary veterans. You got a really well-rounded product now. So they started getting up there in the ratings, you know, and Nitro was starting to really get traction. And you had that big defection there with Lex Luger, who nobody knew that that he wasn't still working for WWF. Everybody thought he was, but they just had a handshake deal, and he decided to go against that handshake deal, because back then they didn't have guaranteed contracts like they do now, you know. All that's because of WCW. They changed the game. They changed the face of wrestling because of all the different tactics that they used during the Monday Night Wars. But obviously the whole game changed once Hulk Hogan went bad, and they formed the N.W.O. with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, the Outsiders as they were called. And they formed the New World Order, and that just blew the roof off the whole world of wrestling when you saw Hulk fans saying, "You fans can stick it, brother." And he started coming to the ring wearing all black and, you know, spray painting people in the back, and and they became like a gang, you know, like a street gang almost. It was really cool, and people were really into it, you know. It was something new and something different. You got these young bucks, these monsters with the legend, and it was like these three big WWE guys taking over WCW, and that's how it looked to the average fan, and that's the way they played it in WCW. And they just ran over every single WWE superstar until the point where the WCW veterans were starting to get pissed off, like, what the hell, what am I working here for, just to get beat up by the N.W.O, because they just ran over everybody. So they had to come up with something, and they came up with Sting, you know, Sting, who had been the golden boy before Hulk Hogan came in. He was the Hulk Hogan of WCW. Now they decide he needs to be the guy to go up against the N.W.O. And yeah, the fans really bought into that. And Sting started coming out with the black trench coat, and he painted his face white, and he looked like the Crow. You know, the movie with Brandon Lee. Sometimes he even came out with the Crow, and you'd see him up in the rafters, and that was really cool. And he would never talk, you know. So he had a real edge to him. He was like this anti-hero going up against the N.W.O. He always was the foil in their plans. So you had all that going on, and then you had someone like Goldberg, this young lion, this big jacked up, bald, badass dude, you know, just running people over, you know. And he became another guy to go against N.W.O. And then you had Diamond Dallas Page, this like country redneck guy with the bang and the he was pretty cool too, you know. He brought a different side of things, and you know, they started bringing in celebrities like Jay Leno and Karl Malone, Dennis Rodman, you know, and they started getting huge ratings, you know. And they started taking over the WWE. Every week they was winning in the ratings. They get like 4 million views, 3 billion views. Yeah, it was crazy. They were winning consistently every week for almost 2 years, so WWE was really starting to hurt, you know. And at that time, they had a lot of stupid cartoony characters going on, like Papa Shango and the Repo Man and the Garbage Man and Doink the Clown. A lot of really stupid stuff going on. It's like, damn, we better do something different. And that's when they started making an edgier product, you know. They had to do something to respond to it. But I was honestly not a fan of the Attitude Era. They were doing a lot of stupid stuff, like way over the top with the sexuality and the, you know, they pretty much used women as like objects, in my opinion, you know. You had Sable walking around with her breasts hanging out, and they would just paint it, you know. It's like, really? And women were wearing next to nothing. And they were just like objects. They wouldn't have like real matches. They had bra and panties matches, and they'd be mud wrestling, and it's like, I didn't like that, you know. And you had Val Venus, who looked like a porn star, come out with a towel, and there's a lot of stuff that I didn't like. I didn't like some of the over-the-top stuff with The Undertaker, where he'd have fire on stage, and he would have people crucified on the crosses. I'm like, this is so over the top and ridiculous. But Stone Cold, to me, was the exception. Stone Cold and The Rock and Mankind, they were cool. Stone Cold definitely felt like a real guy, like a real character, like an anti-hero, this blue-collar worker who just drank beer and just told you to screw off, giving people a finger, you know. There was something about him. I really liked him. And The Rock was so charismatic on the mic, you know, great mic skills. He was a great actor, too, you know. Whenever they worked together, they had great matches. And you had Mick Foley, the hardcore guy that just took bumps like you wouldn't believe. I mean, especially in the Hell in the Cell match, that was legendary. He fell like 20 feet from the steel cage. I was falling on thumbtacks, taking chair shots. So that side of things I liked. Whenever it was Stone Cold or The Rock or Mankind, I thought that stuff was cool. But I didn't like a lot of the crazy sex stuff with DX, and I never liked the Generation X, by the way. But once they started pushing the envelope, that's when WWE started getting traction there. And the one thing that I think really put them over is when they had Mike Tyson on there getting up in Stone Cold's face. I was like, oh, wow. You know? But I was still more of a fan of WCW. I still felt like they had the better product, because you had not only N.W.O. stuff, and not only stuff with the veterans like Flair and the Four Horsemen and Goldberg and Sting, you had all that. Plus you had the cruiserweight stuff going on, which was really exciting. You had the Japanese people with the crazy masks. You had the high flyers, the lucha libres like Rey Mysterio, Jushin Thunder Liger, and stuff like that. The Great Muta. And then you had people like Chris Jericho, the young cruiserweight guys that were smaller in stature, but they had great athletic ability. Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero, of course. So I think all together they had a better product, but things started to change when they started watering down N.W.O. They had too many people joining. It's like everybody was joining the N.W.O. every week, you know. So they had to break up the N.W.O. and make, the Wolf Pack with Hall and Nash, that side, and they had the Black and White Express with Hulk Hogan, and they had the Latino World Order with Conan and Eddie Guerrero and stuff like that. It just got so watered down and started getting boring, you know. And, you know, they started making some big mistakes, too. It's like Eric Bischoff got so full of himself that he stopped paying attention. I don't know what happened, but they started doing stuff like the finger poke of doom, you know, like, and they made some huge mistakes, you know. And once WWE started really getting hot, you know, they couldn't counteract anymore. They just didn't know what to do anymore after a while, and it started getting watered down, and then eventually they just fired Eric Bischoff because he couldn't come up with anything to counteract with what WWE was doing. So it started really going downhill, and then they hired, of course, Vince Russo, which in my opinion single-handedly destroyed WCW. Because he decided he wanted to work with the young guys and build up just the young guys and forget about the veterans like Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair. And he just made them part of this stupid group called the Billionaire Clubs versus the Young Bloods. Like, and he brought in these guys that was so green, it was unbelievable. And they botched moves left and right. They just were not ready to be on this big stage taking on WWE. You can't invest in these guys that they're just not there yet. They're still green. They need training, you know. And, you know, you could tell that N.W.O was just, you know, had run its course, you know. So they started having to do different stuff, but everything they were doing were like these stupid gimmick matches, like, you know, and they didn't work. It's just, this guy just had no creativity. Everything he was trying was just failing on every level, you know. These really stupid angles, and they're using these stupid characters. And, you know, some of the big guys were like, screw this, I'm going to WWE, look what they're doing. And they started losing a lot of their big stars like Hulk and Macho Man, and they started trying to build up these guys that had no talent, you know. They weren't good enough. Like Jeff Jarrett, they made him like the top guy, and he just... I like Jeff Jarrett and all, but he's not that good. He's not good enough to be the top guy, come on. And then you started building up Bret Hart, who, in all honesty, was never, to me, a great character. He was a great wrestler, but he was not a great character, in my opinion. But so he wasn't the right guy to be the top guy, you know. And then Goldberg got injured, so he was out for a long time, you know. So he was, like, the biggest star at that time. So having Goldberg gone was not good. So yeah, they started going on a downward spiral, and it just would not stop until eventually they just got their asses kicked in the ratings, you know. And they started doing really stupid stuff with Jeff Jarrett, having him fight against David, what's the guy's name from Scream? David Arquette. And I was like, no. And then he had Kurt Hennig doing the West Texas Rednecks, you know, saying rap is crap and stuff like that. A lot of really stupid angles. And they started having, with the women's wrestling, people like Medusa. They started doing a lot of sex stuff with them, trying to compete with WWE, and I felt like, you know, it was the same kind of thing that I didn't like. It felt like they used women as objects, and, you know, it wasn't working, you know. It worked for WWE, but it wasn't working when WCW tried to do it, because it didn't feel natural. It felt like they were just trying to copy WWE. And a lot of times they were, you know, they were trying to do a lot of the same stuff. And then another thing that bothered me is they changed the WCW logo, and it looked really cheap and crappy, you know. I didn't like that. Yeah, so everything they were doing was not working anymore, and then people started leaving. Then you had 4 guys who were like the workhorses of WCW. N.W.A, Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko all